Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. This week, I'd like to talk about what seems to be a case of attempted retaliation here against teachers who are speaking out against essentially unsafe conditions of reopening and whatnot, and so many more kind of workplace issues regarding education that we've continued to cover. Before we get started with that, though, I want to briefly mention once again that it is Co-op's membership drive. KOOP, where this show originates, is a small community radio station that's been a staple of Austin independent media for a quarter century now. And we, if you've ever appreciated the many news and public affairs programs, as well as the many unique music programs coming out of this station, we certainly could use your help in this trying time, and we hope that we can remain an independent media outlet for another quarter century and beyond. It's truly important in this time when so much of independent media is becoming consolidated, getting bought out or going under. I think it's absolutely crucial to keep independent media, especially community media that's truly vested in the interests of the communities of the states and regions and whatnot alive. So if you're interested in that, if you want to support Co-op, you can go to koop.org and click the donate button now. Again, the website for that is koop.org, and I hope some people will consider becoming members this week as we continue our membership drive. I also want to give a shout out to Ken Zarafis, who's the president of Education Austin, and who brought this issue in San Antonio to my attention. We normally have Ken on. We try and have him on once a month or so to talk about the latest issues regarding teachers in Austin. But I think it's so important because teachers across the country face such similar conditions regarding kind of the struggle for workplace, the struggle for resources and whatnot. And in pretty much every case, those teachers' unions are absolutely crucial to ensuring not just the best outcomes for the teachers themselves who work so hard, but also the best outcomes for the students and parents as well. And so I say all that to bring us into our discussion today, which is around kind of the issues in San Antonio with the San Antonio educators and whatnot. And so to talk about all this, we are joined now by Luke Amphlett, who's a teacher and union representative at Burbank High School. Thank you very much, Luke, for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So I'm looking at an article right now. This is from KSTX. That's the San Antonio NPR affiliate, titled "San Antonio Teacher Union Accuses Principal of Retaliation." Can you talk about basically what all has gone down in San Antonio regarding the kind of reopening situation of schools and whatnot?
Yeah, so reopening in San Antonio is a hugely diverse and fragmented conversation. We have 17 independent school districts in the city as a legacy of historic redlining and racism. Reopening looks very, very different in different places. And in some places in San Antonio, there's like large numbers of students back in classrooms with teachers, really, really bad reopening plans happening. My district isn't quite like that. We have a stronger union and a stronger legacy of organizing, which has reduced the number of students who are coming back. We have much better reopening plans, but things have come to a head over the last week or so as the move to bring students back to campuses has happened, and as educators have started speaking up about what they see as very unsafe reopening plans that have a lot of holes in them, a lot of unanswered questions, and really, like what we're seeing is people standing up to talk about issues that directly affect them and the lives of their students, their families, the communities that we serve, and either being ignored at best or potentially retaliated against, and certainly being intimidated into silence. I know you mentioned Ken in Austin earlier. He can tell you a lot about the way that educators feel a lot of the time in the schools in which we work, in our workplaces, the extent to which we have a voice in those workplaces, and the kind of constant feelings of intimidation and threat of retaliation that are often used to make sure that educators aren't speaking to issues that directly impact the public. I was just somebody who was in a situation like that, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a second. But overall, schools in San Antonio are moving towards reopening, with between 5% and 65% of students returning. And so this is the moment this week that we're seeing the first official reopenings in San Antonio, and we're really seeing for the first time educators facing this very dangerous moment for them and their students. And we're seeing the ways that they're trying to push back on situations that have real health consequences for everybody.
I have been at a bit of a loss when I'm thinking about sort of the real force to, or the push to reopen schools, so quote unquote reopen schools, when so much of the country remains in some sort of, even if not a complete lockdown scenario, in some sort of scenario that maintains a high level of social distancing, or should maintain a high level of social distancing. And all across the country, this is not possible realistically within schools. So many schools were already facing overcrowding problems, or a good number of schools were facing overcrowding problems. Before the pandemic, students kind of switch out. Obviously, like, students switch out classes all day. The idea of really being able to phase in a reopening, it seems like you're basically just at that point, at really any point, other than with the absolute most drastic measures, if you start bringing students physically back into schools, you're putting not just their lives at risk, but the lives of parents and teachers. And you're basically simply going to phase in the coronavirus again. We have seen kind of ups and downs, and the ups usually correspond to an attempt to reopen. That is to say, like, coronavirus tends to rise when there's this attempt to reopen. And then a few weeks or whatnot later, usually about 2 weeks after this reopening, you see a spike in coronavirus cases, which leads to, once again, that implementation of kind of stricter masks and other kind of city and state regulations to control it again. It seems like this is just postponing everything. This is just kind of keeping us in this cycle of constant ups and downs. It doesn't seem like there seems to be a real plan from what I've seen. Really from any sector of government, but certainly within kind of the school administration side of things, it doesn't seem like there's really any sort of dealing with kind of these hard realities.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, so, we want to be wrong about this. We really want to be wrong. I would love to be proven to be completely wrong about the fears that I have and that other educators have. That would be the happiest day of our lives. But the situation that we foresee is that we're going to see more spikes in COVID cases because of school reopening or connected to school reopening. And it's going to put everybody in our communities at risk. And that's why, everybody in Austin, everybody in San Antonio and Dallas and Houston, everywhere else you can name, is working really hard to reduce the number of students who are coming into schools, or to prevent it from happening at all at this moment. And I think that there are very real economic imperatives, right? The imperatives of capitalism, the imperatives of a settler colonial society, in extracting value from nature and from human beings through exploitation, which are really interfered with by schools closing. And those of us who've worked in the labor movement know that schools are a really important strategic location for social struggle, because they play such an important role in the economy and in the functioning of our society. Schools being in operation allow other people to go and make value, create profit, labor for the profit of other people. And schools being closed does interfere with that. And I think what we're seeing is, in stark contrast to a lot of places in, for example, Europe or in East Asia, which have really stamped on and stopped the spread of COVID-19, we are seeing the imperative of profit massively riding roughshod over the imperative of preserving human life at this moment. And I agree with you, Bree, completely that what we're likely to see in a few weeks' time is more shutdowns, more spikes of COVID-19, and then we will have put people's lives at risk for a very short-lived experiment in school reopening. The problem is, when you speak up about things like that in these quite authoritarian, often institutions that aren't very democratic, you tend to face retaliation or pushback. And most people kind of already know, just through their experience of, working in the American workplace, that it's virtually impossible to speak up about these things without facing repercussions. So, we love that people in the community speak up for us and share their concerns about this, because you speak to most teachers and they are scared about going back. They cannot see the logic in going back. They have never felt more expendable than they currently do, which is in stark contrast to the messages in March and April and May, when we heard that teachers should be earning $1 billion, and everybody working with their kids at home was realizing how difficult teaching is. And teachers were being exalted. A few months later, we see the normalization of using teachers essentially to open the economy up again, lumping them into this category, this really troubling category of so-called essential workers, which really just means sacrificial workers, right? People who are ruling class in this country are willing to sacrifice in the interest of profit. And for a lot of us who are teachers, that has come as quite a shock.
Yeah, essential workers or expendable workers, as we're seeing across
Exactly.
all of these industries for sure. I would like to kind of get into some of the specifics of your case, and I want to just kind of quote a little bit from again this article from the San Antonio NPR affiliate that says, quote, according to the San Antonio Alliance of Teachers and Support Personnel, Burbank's union representative, which is you, was called into a meeting on Monday and questions about union activities before he was placed on paid administrative leave. And then Alliance Representative Diana De Leon, who attended the meeting with Amphlett, described his suspension as an attempt to, quote, quiet or muzzle our members in regard to this, in speaking with regard to the campus reopening. And it's later described as a quote, clear case of attempted union busting by the Texas AFT. Can you tell me basically exactly what it is that you kind of faced sort of as you attempted to raise these issues, and what sort of union busting you've seen as well?
Yeah, so, the questioning started when I and a number of other teachers started raising questions in a faculty meeting, about 2 weeks ago, a little less than 2 weeks ago. Really, as we were being presented with a safety plan, we started asking questions about it because it really wasn't a safety plan, right? A plan for safe school reopening that just didn't have a plan. We were asking administrators really should be very simple questions to answer about air conditioning, about the way the students were going to move through the day, about testing, about taking temperatures, all of these things that anybody who knows anything about this subject should be able to answer very quickly. And I can say that having worked for the whole of the summer with a coalition that worked with epidemiologists, public health experts, students, parents, at every education union in Bexar County, which is about 20 different unions, on plans for safe school reopening. So I understand this information. I've worked with the CDC guidelines a lot. I have some understanding of what I'm talking about. And repeatedly in this meeting, I and other educators asked questions, but also offered our help. I literally said, I can do some of this work with you. I'd love to be involved. I'll join the safety committee. We can work together on solving it. And really, the administration shut down questions. The only response that we really got was, you have a choice, which is to come back to work or lose your job. That's basically it. That's the only real answer. These questions obviously weren't questions that anybody wanted to answer. Had to ask them repeatedly to get any kind of a response. And then after that meeting, immediately after, a group of us, about a third of the entire faculty at my high school, met on Zoom, and we had a conversation about it. A lot of union members, some non-union members involved in this conversation. And we met several times over the next few days and drafted a letter of our concerns to our principal. Well, we asked for a meeting with our principal to address these concerns and deliver the letter to her. We were refused that meeting. And then before you know it, I've got a personal meeting with the principal in which I'm grilled about union activities. I'm grilled about organizing. I'm being asked who was in the meetings, what the topics were, all of which are First Amendment protected union activities that you shouldn't be asked about by any school administrator, which questions that don't have to be responded to under those circumstances. And based on my answers in that space, although I think the decision had already been made, I was placed on paid administrative leave. And honestly, I think that the goal of that really was just to get me out of the campus, because I was organizing with other teachers, literally in defense of human life, right? In defense of our lives, the lives of our students, the lives of the entire community. You know, I work in a community on the south side of San Antonio that has a lot of multi-generational households who live in poverty. Kids who live with their abuelito and their abuelita, and who are at real risk of taking this illness home from a congregate setting into spaces where older family members with underlying conditions, vulnerable family members, are at real risk, right? Real risk of death or serious complications. So a lot of us were speaking out about this issue. I got singled out as the ringleader, as the kind of individualized troublemaker, and placed on administrative leave. And 3 days later, I was reinstated after a huge campaign, basically. So a huge public campaign waged by educators, but especially by students, my current students, former students, and community members with whom I've worked. A lot of organizations like DSA and SA Stands, which is an immigration coalition with which I work, really coming out and organizing email campaigns, phone calls, a lot of social media activity to get me reinstated. And just 3 days later, I was back in my job. And our district had been forced into an enormous turnaround, an enormous U-turn, just by public pressure.
In this case, it seems like, not only the kind of the outpouring of support from students, but also, of course, obviously the power of the union there as well. All of these work together in order to essentially protect these rights to continue to speak out, as you said, in defense of human life here. I just want to also remind people that you are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM, which is having our membership drive now. You can find that information at koop.org. We are also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM, New Orleans. We're available as a podcast wherever podcasts are podded. And it's, of course, since we do our broadcast on another small community station in New Orleans, and I think this is important because there is this kind of a disaster, what people call disaster capitalism, what Naomi Klein especially has kind of literally written the book on as far as disaster capitalism with shock doctrine and whatnot. And this basic idea that in times of crisis, which we're going to have certainly more of in the years to come with the kind of impact of global warming, we're already seeing that. And we're going to be discussing the situation in Louisiana where the hurricane that hit there fairly recently had such an impact and was not covered the way it should have been covered. It still needs to be covered. But yeah, we see the situation with, again, this quote, disaster capitalism, where the school district in New Orleans and the sort of city administration in New Orleans used that opportunity, used Hurricane Katrina as a way to privatize the entirety of the school district. To just simply say that since nobody is here to stop us, since we're in such a time of chaos, we're going to use this to carry out this horrifying experiment where we just completely gut the school district and move it all toward this quote-unquote charter school model, essentially a privatization scheme that put all of these public resources in these private corporate hands and whatnot. I wonder how much that if there's a connection here to like sort of what these school administrators today are trying to do with regard to their own districts. Maybe not, but it's hard to tell because I don't see what the motive would be for these school administrators just sort of going along with the program of trying to keep these schools open. It just seems like an absolute road to ruin to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are different levels and different imperatives and different pressures on different people. A lot of school administrators, I say this with love, aren't selected because they're the best educators, but are selected because of obedience, right? They are deferential to authority. They do what they're told, and they climb the ladder in school administration by essentially taking orders from above and pushing them down on people below, like however bad those orders are. And a lot of the things that we're told to do by administrators in our schools are trash. They're not the best thing for children. The over-testing, the punitive discipline, there's so many different things that we do in our schools that are not for the benefit of our kids, and that administrators are willing to force teachers into doing every single day. And I don't think this is very different from that. But I agree with you, Bree. At higher levels in authority, there's definitely different imperatives. And we're in one of the school districts that is ground zero for charter takeovers. We have a superintendent who is very charter friendly. He comes out of the Broad School, which is a historically very charter friendly reform movement in education that is hugely billionaire backed. And we see them coming. And you're absolutely right. After this wave, the COVID disaster, we have a depression coming, a global depression, which is going to bring with it new waves of austerity. And we know that those are going to be used as a mechanism for dismantling and privatizing the public sphere even more than it is right now. So we see Donald Trump going after the post office. There's nothing new there. Democrats have gone after it for years as well. And we're about to see another attack on public education, most definitely. And I would just say that, we need to connect that whenever we talk about it to a 500-year project of enclosure, of primitive accumulation, of accumulation by dispossession on this continent. The emergence of capitalism situated in the genocide of indigenous peoples and the theft of human beings from Africa, right, giving birth to this economic system, which continues at this moment, plundering rainforests, pushing indigenous people off their lands throughout the Americas, causing massive waves of migration, which then obviously are criminalized. So we see in the same thing that happened in New Orleans that is happening with the attack on the public sphere in San Antonio, the same thing that is happening and has been happening for 500 years on this continent. And we situate ourselves very much in the battle for public control, for community control, for the people to own, the means of production, to own the public sphere and establish and maintain a commons. And we see public education as one of the key battlegrounds for that work. My sister works in the NHS in England, and they have the same fight there because, public healthcare is under attack in England. We see every component of the public good, like the post office and public education, under constant attack. And this crisis will definitely be used as a means, just like Naomi Klein explains, to try to break unions, which is what we're seeing right now. Right, this was a clear union busting attempt, an attempt to break the power of the union in a moment when it needed to stand up for its members, and then to attack public schooling and move towards the charterization or the privatization through vouchers or whatever means of all of our public schools.
I couldn't agree more with all of what you just said. I really appreciate that kind of level of analysis and that situation, that kind of placing of sort of the international situation and the historical situation as sort of like the roots of these problems. Because if you don't, I'll say this over and over again on this show, which is pretty much half of sort of like talking to people in the struggles at that particular moment, and then half sort of reflecting on the larger social, political, economic battles and sort of historic and theoretical concepts there. And so, to understand what it is that's going on, you also have to understand that historical trajectory. To understand what it is you're fighting, you have to, at a very baseline, understand like who it is, who's your friend, who's your enemy. You have to understand the class backings of this or that system. You have to you basically have to know like where you've been to know where you're going. You need to like be able to calculate that trajectory and whatnot. And so that is absolutely crucial. So yeah, I think we have a couple minutes left. I'd like to sort of give you a chance if you'd like to sort of give people kind of ways to find more information about these struggles that we've talked about today, or if you'd like to just kind of talk about what is sort of the next move for you and for the many teachers kind of fighting these struggles in San Antonio.
I mean, so the next move for us is that we're still moving forward. Face-to-face instruction in my district has started today. We have very small numbers of students in schools. And what we did last week, the struggle last week, which was uncomfortably centered on me, but was really about thousands of other people, right? It was about the safety of thousands of people. It really produced new scrutiny, shone a spotlight on our district reopening plans. And schools are opening more safely this week than they would have been if we hadn't stood up. And I think it's really important to remember that, like, we didn't get the maximal victory of everybody not going back to unsafe working environments, but they are much safer because we've engaged in these struggles this week than they would have been if we hadn't. And I would just say massive props to all of the people who are standing up in this moment, because they tried to squash me and take me out as like a ringleader and a troublemaker. And what they got instead is huge numbers of teachers who've never stood up before across our district are standing up, and they're organizing, they're writing letters of their own concerns. Huge numbers of students just realized their power, right? They just realized that they managed to organize petitions and phone call campaigns and email writing campaigns to get a teacher that they cared about and that they wanted to stand with reinstated in the space of a few days. Just realize this incredible power that they have. And I think it's too infrequent, or we speak too infrequently about the power of these intersectional spaces, right? Spaces where the interests of educators, of families, of our communities, of organizations which do things like community organizing and radical organizing, and then our students intersect. And where we find places where all of those groups of people can reach consensus and move together, we're very, very powerful. And we saw that last week. And I hope we're going to see it again in the future, because it was a really beautiful thing to see the outpouring of solidarity. And while it was centered on me, it was really about the safety of everybody. And it was really about the fact that even though our public schools allegedly belong to the people, we see that educators, that parents and community members and students are excluded from decision-making at every turn. And people stood up and said that wasn't okay last week. And this week, we're going to continue that fight.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to wrap up. I really appreciate it. And that's such a, given the sort of struggles ahead, given the obvious sort of difficulties, the obvious challenges that those of us invested in fighting for true justice and liberation face. I think that's kind of a great inspirational place to leave our story or our first story today. So yeah, I just want to mention once again, I think we were joined by Luke Amphlett, who's a teacher and union representative at Burbank High School in San Antonio. Thank you very much, Luke, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
You are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM, which also streams online at koop.org, based in Austin. You can go to coop.org to learn about our membership drive, which is going on now. We are also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans, and we're available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. Welcome back to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. I'm going to mention once again that, of course, this show starts on Co-op Radio. That's KOOP, which you can find at koop.org. We have our membership drive now as one of the few, if possibly the only completely cooperatively run radio station in the country. I believe that our station is absolutely key to a more democratic form of media, in which I believe absolutely. So if you've appreciated any of the content on my show or any of the programming that otherwise airs on KOOP in the Austin area, or if you've appreciated any of the wonderful music programs as well, there's so much going on at Co-op Radio. And if you just believe in the mission of community media generally and believe in its importance at this time of corporate consolidation, now is the time for you to consider hopefully becoming a member. You can find that information at koop.org. And you can find the donate button and all of the wonderful swag you can get as a member, as a sustaining member of Co-op Radio. So I want to mention that real fast. And so, yeah, for our next segment, I would like to turn to the Philippines and sort of the political developments that have happened there as the Duterte government there continues to clamp down on political dissent. So to talk about various issues regarding the Philippines, we are joined now by Sarah Jalandun, who's the co-coordinator for Malaya Movement Texas. Thank you very much, Sarah, for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Brianna.
Yeah, so glad to have you, and so glad to talk about the Philippines once again. I'll admit it's been about a year since we've last covered the Philippines, and I think it's so important that people understand that the Philippines, like many other sort of countries throughout the world, are essentially the dictatorial tendencies of Duterte are largely propped up by U.S. military interests as the U.S. seeks to achieve quote unquote full spectrum dominance there. There are a lot of stories we can cover here, but I'm wondering kind of what you can tell us generally about sort of the political situation in the Philippines in the past couple months. I would say since the State of the Nation and the kind of Malaya movement's response of the People's State of the Nation, the People's SONA. If you can bring us up to speed, just generally.
Yes. So unfortunately, it just seems as though as each week goes by, we hear tragic news after tragic news regarding what's happening back home for a lot of us. The most recent developments have been with Joseph Scott Pemberton, the U.S. Marine who murdered Jennifer Laude, a trans Filipino woman, back in 2014. And he was convicted and charged with homicide, but did not serve any sort of prison, jail time under the Philippine government. And that's due to exactly what you mentioned, that relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines. The Visiting Forces Agreement has been around for multiple administrations now. And basically, that U.S.-Philippine allyship is so strong so as to even protect U.S. troops in the Philippines. They don't have bases, but they do have places where they have trained, where they congregate, not just Navy, not just Air Force, but the Marines. And yes, he was convicted and did not serve any time under Philippine custody at all. In fact, was serving time in a private U.S. Detention center in the Philippines. And so you could say, basically got away with murder. And not only have we just received news that he is going to be released, but we also received news that President Duterte has pardoned him. So this goes not just for human rights defenders, human rights activists, but for the LGBTQ community, for the Philippine people. We are outraged. We were planning on already having, some sort of memorial to her come October, which was when she was murdered. We have planned events, coming up, and we always target Filipino American History Month, which is in October. And something like this is just a huge, huge disrespect to the Filipino people. And for someone who is a murderer and a dictator, to pardon someone who has murdered a Filipina, it speaks volumes. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to understand that when, so much of kind of these U.S. political battles are largely just kind of, such surface level things. And I want to, I guess, use a specific example where I guess Trump had made some disparaging remarks about John McCain, had called the U.S. military suckers and whatnot. And that the U.S. military were quote unquote losers. And so this became sort of the subject of a long sort of Twitter debate, this is sort of the national conversation as to like whether or not Donald Trump is sufficiently militaristic and jingoistic as the Democrats again try to outflank him from the right. Meanwhile, something like this happens, the pardoning of a U.S. Marine that killed a transgender Filipino woman. It doesn't even really register as a major story in that same way. And so when we talk about sort of these, the quote unquote intersectional issues regarding LGBTQ people and the military, the only real thing we hear about is sort of the inclusion of, for instance, trans people in the military, or the exclusion of trans people in, of course, the U.S. military, and the effects of the U.S. military's presence in countries like the Philippines. It's not even a subject for conversation. It's not something that I think Americans even realize is going on. But essentially, like there is never going to be a progressive U.S. military. There's never going to be, with something like the Visiting Forces Agreement. There's no kind of way this can be retooled to be a progressive thing when, again, like you have people, as we said, literally getting away with murder. You have U.S. troops getting away with murder in the Philippines as sort of a continuing occupying military force, whether it's using those specific terms or not, whether the terms military bases are used or not. Like, the U.S. remains this occupying military force in so much of the world. I'm wondering if you can talk about that kind of relationship just a little bit, sort of like what is this Visiting Forces Agreement, and how's the U.S. military sort of posture itself within the Philippines?
This relationship has been continuous since, I think, mainly like World War II and on. Obviously, like the U.S. has been really interested in the Philippines because of the resources that we have, the economy that we provide for the U.S., the labor export policies. But as far as military goes, Visiting Forces Agreement is such a solid allyship that they can train, they can take up space, they can work for private corporations and protect those private corporations and landlords. We've heard from even our indigenous peoples that they say to us, it's weird that we have soldiers that have light skin, like they have very fair skin, and they're here, and they're supposed to be this protection, supposedly. When we ask, our representatives, we need to pull U.S. soldiers out of the Philippines, they respond with, well, they're there to protect the Filipino people. They're there to protect U.S. interests. They're there against terrorism. And these counterinsurgency programs have really targeted our indigenous peoples, have pushed people out of their communities, have bombed schools. It's just, but for this allyship, the VFA, they cannot go against the U.S., and the U.S. cannot go against the Philippines. So in a way, they protect each other in what they're complicit in, which is to be against the Filipino people. Visiting Forces Agreement was said to have been terminated in word, as in Duterte was just mouthing off in a rant back in February, saying, y'all want to ban certain Filipino senators from the U.S. Well, I will terminate the Visiting Forces Agreement. Some people got excited, but we said, let's monitor it, because it is only in a rant that he said this, and he said he would give them 90 days to vacate the Philippines. That did not happen.
That sounds, yeah, that sounds very Trumpian in a lot of ways, in terms of sort of like saying something regarding sort of the pseudo-populist idea. And I think that this may be a hallmark of Duterte himself. I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, I believe Duterte is originally from Mindanao, correct? Or did I misremember that detail?
Yes, he was the former mayor of Davao, even guilty of extrajudicial killings back then. Okay,
so essentially the context for a lot of this is that Mindanao has been essentially kind of under increasing, even close to, from my understanding, a military occupation, and sort of essentially under the guise of an anti-terrorist campaign. Essentially, the military has engaged in what is really a terrorist campaign, what is really a sort of violent forcing of people off their lands in order to essentially, at the bidding of kind of largely U.S. larger U.S. corporations who are seeking to sort of control the mineral rights of that area and whatnot. And so it's I think in some ways there's kind of a parallel between Duterte and Trump, in that they both sort of gesture toward something quote unquote populist, or at least they did at kind of one point. And then when push came to shove, essentially it was an intensification of the same bigotry, the same, the same sort of jingoism, and the same sort of essentially like endless military occupation. Is that still kind of the case within Mindanao? And is that a fair comparison, or am I kind of misremembering some of the details here from last time I covered this?
No, I'm happy you drew that you drew those parallels, and it has been that way with Mindanao. Mindanao has always been under scrutiny. They've used the excuse of counterinsurgency plans, ways to protect the people, ways to keep the peace, ways to make sure that there isn't some sort of uprising. Mindanao, due to the Islamic population, has also been criminalized and to be groups of terrorism. And so that terrorism, that word has broadened enough to make it into law. The Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 was implemented into law shortly before we did the People's Sana, the People's State of the Nation address. And that was one thing we really had to push prior for it to being implemented into law. We kept saying the broadening of this. We've studied this bill as it was being presented. Duterte himself presented it to the House, and he claimed he had nothing to do with it, that this was not his bill. But this was definitely something that he handed down to folks below him, and it extends its jurisdiction, extends all the way to the U.S. So for activists like us who are speaking up here, they have just red tagged. This has been a way that they have gotten away with a lot of the extrajudicial killings. So what they do is they criminalize you. You know, they call you terrorists. They call us communists, and they say that our work is not safe for the people. That we are just what did they say? The wording in the bill was the intent to incite terrorism, to incite terroristic acts. So, you know, you could be at a rally and they use the Black Lives Matter movement to help implement the law. They said, you know, we don't want riots. Riots are happening in the U.S. This is just to protect the safety of the people. And a lot of Duterte people will say that. They'll say, you know, the military is here. Yeah, they're, you know, all over the place. There's checkpoints, but they're here really for our safety, to protect us from COVID.
How exactly does one protect someone from COVID with a gun? I mean, that kind of boggles my mind. How many tanks do we need? Because if the military was protection against COVID, I mean, the U.S. would be the country with the lowest number of cases in the world. If military might could protect one from COVID. Instead, what we see is the exact opposite, where the U.S. military, wherever it is present, and I'll use Okinawa as the example here, the U.S. military is usually responsible for, like, at this point, the kind of spread of COVID cases. Okinawa was largely a free zone of COVID until an outbreak happened on the U.S. military base, at which point it became a kind of scourge on the local population. And so that's the real effect, you know, again, like not just with the U.S. military, but again, like the idea that the military forces of any country can use their might, the actual might of their violence alone to protect people from COVID. Absolutely absurd. There was a kind of one other, I think, point on that I want to raise. Oh yeah, this kind of is ever growing kind of prospect of combating everything under terrorism. It has a kind of long and sad history. Like at one point, I guess the Philippines had, I think, the largest communist party, the largest communist organization anywhere in the world, and through kind of sheer, you know, essentially through sheer violence, through sheer terror unleashed by, again, previous U.S.-backed dictatorships, that was kind of brutally suppressed. So this idea, again, that it's quote-unquote communist, this always this specter of the left somehow being behind everything is always used as sort of this farce for these sort of dictatorial systems to unleash just massive massive waves of violence. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the way Duterte in particular has used this kind of specter that we were just talking about, like trying to blame Black Lives Matter, trying to stave off quote unquote riots, to essentially lead these attacks on these progressive movements, on these kind of anti-war movements, and on basically anyone who sort of speaks out against this regime.
Absolutely. Yeah, Duterte, since he took office in 2016, has definitely focused his efforts on criminalizing people. So we called the war on drugs the war on the people, because 30,000 were slain under this guise of, these are drug lords. And they were really drug suspects. There were people put on a drug list. And that many people who didn't get a fair trial, did not get court hearings, they were just assassinated. And the folks that spoke up alongside these killings, were also harassed, were also attacked, and were also killed. And to see it now unfolding, we try to definitely educate folks as much as possible what the term red tag, to be red tagged as an organization, which my movement is red tagged now, as an organization, we have to outright reject that and to condemn that and surround folks with some education. That term red tagging comes from, folks just pointing the finger and saying, you're a communist. And we let folks know, not that communism is bad. We don't think that communism is bad. But it is a death sentence in the Philippines. So to say that without any sort of education, to say, this person does drugs, and to have that person killed, to say, but they were at this rally, they are probably dangerous, and they pose a threat to the community, even with non-violent protests happening, even with protests that are happening 6 feet apart from each other, because they say, no, it's actually for COVID safety. You could be following the rules to a T and still be killed. Two of the latest killings that have happened that have been horrific and tragic and absolutely brutal, right down to what has actually killed these two activists. Randall Echanes, also known as Randy, had survived how many administrations worth of fighting for the people. He was a political prisoner at one point, and he was in his 70s, and he was stabbed multiple times by multiple people before he was killed. So he had torture marks. And then once they did the autopsy, they even tried to take his body. And they took his body and they said, this was just a robbery gone wrong. And his wife was like, no, I deed the body. And to do that disrespect, even after someone has passed, the paralegal that went to go reclaim the body was arrested for just doing respect, like doing the family that dignity and respect. The day that Randy was laid to rest, Zara Alvarez, another human rights activist in another island, was shot to death. And she was a person who was really recording these extrajudicial killings. She had received harassment. She had asked for protection. And she herself was also a political prisoner at one point back in 2013, I believe. And to have her be killed, our people are really mourning. And so it's just, with the increase of repression, I think comes the increase of resistance. We are tired and we are mourning as a community, as a people. And yet now more than ever, we tell folks we have got to speak up. We have got to fight back. And there are ways to do that here in the U.S.
Yeah, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. I just want to also briefly once again mention that Co-op has membership drive going on right now. If you've ever appreciated the independent analysis on our show and on other shows, or if you appreciate just community radio in general, you can go to koop.org and learn more. We are speaking right now with Sarah Jalandun, who's the co-coordinator for the Malaya Movement Texas. And I think this is a great place to actually segue into, as you were talking about, this kind of harsh repression breeds its resistance. This attempt to clamp down on all sort of attempt to speak back against a regime, as we've seen historically, as we see all across the world, only really increases, I think, the resolve of those people who see what injustice looks like to continue fighting and speaking out against injustice, as the Malaya movement is doing across the U.S. and across Texas. So yeah, I'm wondering if we can actually talk about sort of the work that you and your organization does, as much as you'd like to get into it.
Yes. So we were convened as a human rights and a political network. We're made up of different organizations and individuals, professionals from different sectors all across the U.S., but it was mainly started as a concern due to the extrajudicial killings. Malaya movement is only 2 years old. Started back in 2018 and has really grown significantly. Just in the past few months, they've added chapters in Colorado, Georgia, Alaska, and I want to say Hawaii. I believe. If those last two are wrong, I'm so sorry. But yeah, even in Texas, we're really growing. We, along with two other organizations, the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, as well as Bayan USA. Actually, not Bayan USA, but Bayan USA has done a lot of work with us as well. And Kabataan Alliance. We have really pushed for the Philippine Human Rights Act to be introduced here in the United States. We had contacted, each chapter has contacted their local representatives. This was a way for us to really take action, because here in the US, our tax dollars fund Philippine police, Philippine military. And now we have confirmed that Philippine police are now here in the States. They have outposts. The one that we've confirmed is in San Francisco. And so one of the things that we really worked on is to suspend US aid to the Philippines until these human rights violations cease, or until those who are in charge of that, who are complicit, who carry these out, are held accountable. We've gotten pushback, people saying, you can't really do that. The US and the Philippines have had this relationship. So we've taken a step back. We've asked, okay, have an audit, then hold an audit then. See where the money is going, and ensure that it isn't funding the military and the police.
There's always this kind of point at which political moments turn, at which revolutions happen, where, sort of before whatever the flashpoint was, it was always called impossible. And afterwards, it was always called inevitable. It's always, impossible to force this change, or so we're told, until the day that it actually happens. I mean, of course, the idea that the U.S. would ever kind of defund apartheid South Africa was something that nobody would have ever said was possible until it was inevitable. With regard to like the U.S. Support for Israel, again, which is an apartheid state, it was always something that was always impossible. And now we're seeing this kind of, we've seen, as I would say, especially since 2014, the sea change in sort of the way people view that relationship. And so these relationships are not permanent. These so many countries own dictatorships and are propped up by this kind of U.S. military industrial complex, and it is absolutely possible to put enough pressure on the U.S. to force a change on the ground that leads to again, like the U.S. stopping funding or stopping this repression or whatnot. Certainly, like those of us who are within the U.S., those of us who kind of live in the belly of the beast, in the middle of this American war machine, that is the push that we need to be thinking about. Because if we want to have social and economic justice within our own borders. We can't have that if our government is exporting terrorism and oppression in other parts of the world. And so that's so incredibly important that we have that internationalist perspective, that we be looking at sort of this international situation, and that we be looking at the crimes that are either committed or enabled by our own government, and say that we are going to stand up and not allow this to happen, and put a stop to this whenever possible. So if you'd like to, we have a couple of minutes left. If you'd like to either kind of respond to any of that, anything else we didn't talk about today that you'd like to mention, and then if you can also just let people know where they can find out more about the Malaya movement and your work.
Yes, thank you again for listening. That is one way that you can definitely participate. You can go online, you can find out who your representative is and let them know that you would like them to endorse the Philippine Human Rights Act. You as an organization can also do that. And I believe there's also individuals like sponsor letters that you can sign on as well. So that would be sent to your representative. It would show like, yes, this person has voiced their concerns about where the money is going, but also let's say your representative is a Republican, like mine is in Texas. I also try to let them know like what are needs here that that funding can go to. Sadly, I have to mention that sometimes, but it gets folks thinking of creative ways to talk to their representatives. You can follow Malaya Movement on Facebook and on Instagram. Our site is also linked as well, and that's also where you can find the links to the PHRA. The PHRA, the Philippine Human Rights Act, also has their own website, and they'll all be linked if you join or if you follow either on social media. So.
Yeah, and just one more time, I just want to mention that Malaya Movement is spelled Malaya movement. You can go to social media I'm looking at on Facebook right now. It's just facebook.com/Malaya Movement. There's also a Malaya Movement Texas. And as you said, it is growing. And yeah, there's a lot of sort of emboldened again, emboldened sort of resistance, people speaking out and people raising their voices against injustice. So I think that's a great place to leave it. We were joined for this segment by Sarah Jalandun, who's the co-coordinator for Malaya Movement Texas. Thank you very much, Sarah, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.